Most people don't realize they're not actually in love with the person. They're in love with the emotional pattern the person creates inside them. Let's begin with something that tends to confuse people until they actually notice the pattern. Emotional distance doesn't necessarily reduce attraction. In many situations, it does the opposite. It can actually make it stronger. People with an avoidant pattern don't respond to connection the way most expect. Instead of moving closer when things deepen, they often create space. And that small shift, from presence to withdrawal, creates a kind of psychological tension that the mind is highly sensitive to. At its core, desire isn't built on ease or constant comfort. It grows through anticipation, uncertainty, and the sense that something could be lost. When someone is steady, emotionally open, and reliably available, the nervous system settles. That's what creates security and long-term stability. But when attention becomes inconsistent or slightly out of reach, the mind starts working overtime. You begin to think about the person more than usual, replay interactions, search for hidden meanings, and read between lines that may not even be there. This is where avoidant patterns can unintentionally intensify attraction. Their distance introduces uncertainty, and the brain doesn't like unresolved uncertainty. So instead of letting it go, you lean forward. You invest more attention, more emotion, more mental energy. Not always because the bond is objectively stronger, but because it feels incomplete. And incomplete experiences tend to occupy far more mental space than ones that feel resolved. It becomes even more powerful when warmth appears and then disappears again. That inconsistency activates the brain's reward system in a very specific way. When rewards are unpredictable, they become more compelling. It's the same psychological mechanism seen in gambling. If you never know when the next reward is coming, you stay engaged longer, hoping to feel that high again. So when an avoidant person shows closeness, attention, or emotional openness, it can feel amplified. And when they pull away, it doesn't just feel like space, it registers as emotional loss. And loss is one of the strongest motivators we have. But the part most people miss is this. The intensity they feel is not always proof of deep compatibility or connection. Often, it reflects scarcity. You're not responding only to the person, you're responding to how unpredictably they show up. And the mind tends to convert rarity into value. What is less available starts to feel more meaningful, even if nothing about its actual substance has changed. On a deeper level, this speaks to how humans naturally create meaning. When something is unclear, the mind doesn't leave it undefined. It assigns interpretation. So emotional distance can start to feel like mystery. Silence gets interpreted as depth. Independence is seen as strength. Lack of clarity gets mistaken for emotional complexity. But in many cases, it isn't depth at all. It's simply distance. Without awareness of this pattern, it becomes easy to confuse emotional unavailability with something profound or rare. Even the act of chasing can start to feel like love itself. That's why people often say they've never felt this way before. And in a sense, they're right. The experience is intense and unfamiliar, but not always because the connection is healthier or deeper. It's often because the nervous system is activated in a cycle of anticipation and uncertainty. That distinction matters because intensity and stability are not the same thing. Once you start recognizing this, the question begins to shift. Instead of asking why you feel so strongly about someone, you start asking what kind of pattern is producing that feeling in the first place. And that awareness changes how you interpret emotional highs. Because emotional distance doesn't just create attraction, it can also shape how intimacy is understood. Many avoidant individuals separate physical closeness from emotional vulnerability. The two don't automatically move together, so they can be physically present, even affectionate or intense in moments, while still maintaining emotional separation underneath. For the other person, this is where confusion usually begins. Most people naturally connect physical closeness with emotional openness. The assumption is simple. If someone is letting you in physically, they must also be letting you in emotionally. But that connection doesn't always exist in the same way here. In avoidant patterns, physical intimacy can happen without emotional exposure. Instead of feeling open or seen, they may still feel internally in control and contained. Meanwhile, the other person begins building meaning from those moments, assuming emotional progress is happening because the physical connection feels real and significant. This creates a split experience. One person starts forming emotional expectations based on shared closeness, while the other remains more detached internally. The result is a dynamic where one side feels things are deepening, while the other maintains distance without necessarily intending harm or manipulation. At first, this can feel freeing. There's excitement, spontaneity, and a lack of heavy emotional pressure. Everything feels present and alive in the moment. But over time, a question starts to surface. What is this actually becoming? Because the physical connection feels too real to dismiss, yet the emotional consistency isn't strong enough to rely on. That tension is where people often get stuck. They try to close the gap by giving more of themselves emotionally, hoping that deeper vulnerability will naturally pull the other person closer. But without mutual emotional engagement, that effort often leads to more imbalance rather than resolution. But avoidant individuals don't tend to move in the same direction when emotional weight increases. In fact, the more depth and emotional intensity enter the dynamic, the more they're likely to step back. Not because they feel nothing, but because what they're feeling starts to go beyond what feels manageable for them internally. So what you're left with is a contradiction. There are moments of closeness that feel meaningful, even profound, sitting right next to an emotional limit that never really expands. And if you're unaware of this pattern, it's easy to turn it inward. You might start wondering if you're expecting too much, or convincing yourself that this is simply how relationships are supposed to feel now. But the issue isn't asking for too much. It's about being with someone whose capacity matches what you're offering. Because real intimacy isn't just physical access. It's access to someone's inner world, their thoughts, their fears, their contradictions, their honesty when things are uncomfortable. When physical closeness and emotional openness don't move together, the experience can feel intense, but it rarely feels grounded or secure. That's where an important question starts to emerge. Are you actually experiencing connection, or just proximity that feels like connection in the moment? Because the difference between those two shapes everything about how this will unfold. And if that distinction isn't clear, it doesn't just distort the relationship, it starts to distort how you see yourself within it. When physical closeness is separated from emotional depth, and you combine that with the pattern we're about to look at, it becomes clearer why these dynamics feel so powerful, yet so unstable at the same time. Because avoidant patterns don't only create distance, they create rhythm. A very specific kind of rhythm: closeness, then withdrawal, then closeness again. At first, it doesn't feel harmful. In fact, it can feel exciting. There are moments where they're present, open, even deeply engaging. You feel a sense of being seen, maybe even chosen. It feels like something is forming in real time. And just as your mind starts to settle into that sense of direction, something shifts. The change isn't always obvious. It might be a slower reply, a subtle emotional shift, a drop in warmth, or a sense that they're no longer fully there in the same way. But the effect is immediate. The connection you were responding to suddenly feels interrupted. Without realizing it, you're now inside a cycle. This push-pull pattern isn't random. On a psychological level, it interacts directly with how the brain processes reward and attachment. When connection is steady, the nervous system stabilizes. But when connection becomes inconsistent, it does the opposite. It heightens attention. This is known as intermittent reinforcement, a powerful behavioral mechanism where unpredictable rewards increase engagement. It works because uncertainty keeps the mind searching. When you don't know when attention or closeness will return, you start paying closer attention to everything. You analyze tone, timing, behavior. You replay conversations. You try to figure out what changed, what you missed, what you did differently. Slowly, your focus shifts away from the person as a whole and onto the pattern itself. And that's where attachment begins to form most strongly. Not from consistent presence, but from contrast. From the difference between how they are when they're close and how they are when they withdraw. Those moments of closeness start to feel significant, even earned, and anything earned tends to feel more valuable in the mind. So when they return, and they usually do, it creates a rush of relief, sometimes even excitement. It feels like resolution. But what's actually being reinforced isn't stability. It's the cycle itself. Pull away, return, repeat. Over time, this doesn't just intensify emotion, it reshapes perception. You stop evaluating the relationship based on consistency and start evaluating it based on peaks. And anything defined by peaks will almost always feel more intense than something steady. But intensity and stability are not the same thing. There's a deeper tension here in human nature. We want both certainty and stimulation, but when forced to choose in the short term, stimulation often wins, even when it costs us clarity later on. So you stay, not because your needs are being met consistently, but because they are occasionally exceeded in ways that feel unforgettable. And those moments become the justification for everything else. But a connection shouldn't rely on emotional absence to feel meaningful. It shouldn't require distance to create appreciation. And it shouldn't leave you in a constant state of trying to get back to something that disappears just as quickly as it appears. Because when a connection becomes a cycle instead of a foundation, you're no longer building anything stable. You're reacting to emotional movement. And the longer that continues, the harder it becomes to tell the difference between genuine connection and conditioned response. So the question shifts. Not, how do I get back to the high, but why does the high only exist in contrast to the lows? And once you see that clearly, the dynamic loses a lot of its grip. You stop confusing emotional turbulence with depth. And as you start to recognize that cycle, the pull, the distance, the return, something else begins to show itself underneath it. Something even more subtle. Because at first, it doesn't feel like distance at all. It feels like alignment. In the early stages, avoidant individuals can be highly attuned. They notice your energy, your values, your emotional tone, and often reflect it back with surprising accuracy. You express passion, they resonate. You share your perspective, and they respond in agreement. You express emotional depth, and they seem to meet you there, sometimes even exceeding your expectations. In those moments, it can feel like you found someone who truly understands you, not just on a surface level, but in a way that feels intuitive and rare. That feeling carries real weight because being understood sits at the core of human emotional needs. When someone reflects your inner world back to you, it creates familiarity, comfort, even a sense of emotional safety. It's easy in those moments to think, this is different, this is rare, this is real. But this is where the dynamic often begins to quietly shift. What looks like deep alignment can sometimes be something more situational than stable. Not necessarily rooted in long-term emotional availability, but in how present and responsive someone is in a given moment. There can be attunement, yes, but attunement is not the same thing as consistency. So early on, they meet you where you are. They reflect your curiosity, your emotional tone, your depth. And because that reflection feels accurate, you naturally open up more. You invest more. You reveal more of yourself. Then, as that emotional exposure increases, the pattern can begin to change. The engagement becomes less layered. The responsiveness becomes less intuitive. The emotional presence that once felt effortless starts to feel selective, even inconsistent. And you're left trying to make sense of it, because it didn't feel like a gradual absence, it felt like a shift. That's what makes this experience so psychologically impactful. It's not that nothing was ever there, it's that something was there, and then it changed. So the mind doesn't immediately question whether the connection was real. It starts questioning why it isn't the same anymore. And in that space of uncertainty, the focus turns inward. You start analyzing yourself. Did I reveal too much? Did I misread their intentions? Was that version of them genuine? But a more grounding question is often this: was that version sustainable? Because mirroring someone's emotional depth in the moment is not the same as having the capacity to sustain that level of connection over time. When responsiveness is based more on present alignment than stable emotional availability, it creates something that feels like depth, but doesn't always function like it in the long run. It becomes a kind of connection built on reflection rather than foundation. And reflections naturally change depending on context, mood, and emotional proximity. This is where many people begin to chase not just the person, but a specific version of them. The version that felt fully present, fully engaged, fully in sync. And as that version becomes less frequent, it often becomes more emotionally significant in hindsight. The mind starts reaching for it, trying to recreate it, as if consistency could be restored through effort alone. But the more stabilizing truth is this: connection isn't defined by how deeply someone can meet you once. It's defined by how consistently they can remain present as emotional reality becomes more complex over time. There's a distinction here between resonance and commitment. Resonance is immediate. It feels natural, even effortless. Commitment is revealed gradually through consistency, especially when things are no longer simple or emotionally light. So when someone mirrors your depth and then withdraws it, the result isn't just confusion, it's dissonance. You're left holding on to an emotional experience that no longer matches the pattern you're currently receiving. And that mismatch can keep you emotionally invested far longer than clarity would, because you're not only reacting to who they are now, you're still emotionally connected to who they once seemed to be. And that becomes a powerful psychological pull. But eventually, the question shifts from was it real to is it repeatable? Because anything that cannot be sustained will eventually pull you into trying to recreate a moment that only existed under specific conditions. And when that realization begins to land, the focus slowly moves away from chasing reflection and toward evaluating reality. Once that shift happens, another layer becomes visible, one that doesn't rely on intensity or inconsistency, but something far more subtle: perception. Avoidant individuals often carry an impression of independence that can be highly attractive at first glance. They don't appear overly needy. They don't constantly seek reassurance. They don't rush emotional definition or demand immediate clarity. There's a sense of self-containment that can read as strength, especially in a world that often equates independence with emotional maturity. And in that space, a kind of intrigue forms. Because when someone doesn't fully reveal themselves, the mind naturally leans in to complete the picture. This is where mystery begins, but mystery is often misunderstood. Mystery is not the same as depth. Mystery is simply missing information. Depth is something that consistently reveals itself over time through behavior, emotional availability, and shared experience. When information is incomplete, the mind doesn't stay neutral. It starts constructing meaning. Silence becomes interpreted as thoughtfulness. Distance becomes interpreted as emotional control. Inconsistency becomes interpreted as complexity. A story begins to form. And the less clarity there is, the more that story expands. This reflects a very human tendency. We struggle with ambiguity, especially in relationships. So when clarity is missing, we don't wait passively for it. We create explanations. And often, those explanations elevate the other person because emotional investment naturally seeks validation. Their independence becomes admirable. Their emotional restraint becomes depth. Their distance becomes uniqueness. But underneath those interpretations, the simpler reality may be that emotional access is limited, not necessarily in who they are, but in how consistently that inner world is shared with you. And when access is limited, perception takes over. You're no longer responding only to what is clearly shown, you're responding to what is partially hidden. And what is hidden almost always carries more psychological weight than what is visible. This is why people can feel more pulled towards someone they don't fully understand than someone who is consistent and emotionally clear. Because clarity reduces projection, while ambiguity expands it. But projection is not connection. And without awareness, this can slowly shift you further away from what is actually happening, toward a version of the relationship that exists more in interpretation than in lived consistency. And the more you invest in that interpretation, the harder it becomes to step back and see things clearly. What starts as attraction slowly turns into projection. And when projection goes unchecked, It can keep you emotionally tied to something that isn't fully present in the way you believe it is. This is where awareness becomes essential, because the moment you separate what you actually know about someone from what you are filling in, the illusion starts to weaken. You stop being pulled in by what is hidden and start focusing on what is consistently shown. That shift changes everything. Real connection doesn't require guessing, decoding silence, or inventing meaning out of gaps. It becomes visible over time through consistency, presence, and actions that match words. So the question is no longer, why do they feel so intriguing? But what do I actually have evidence of? When you ground yourself in that, mystery loses its emotional control. It becomes something you can observe instead of something you're consumed by. And once you anchor yourself in what is real instead of what is imagined, the focus naturally shifts. It becomes less about them and more about what is being activated within you. Because avoidant patterns don't just create attraction through distance or inconsistency, they often trigger deeper emotional wiring, especially in people with anxious attachment tendencies. This isn't about labeling anyone, it's about understanding how two patterns can lock together in a way that feels intense but is rooted in something older than the present relationship. When someone gives just enough closeness to create hope, but not enough to create stability, it can trigger a powerful drive, the urge to earn consistency. And for many people, that drive is familiar. It reflects earlier experiences where love felt uncertain or conditional. So the connection starts to feel meaningful in a very specific way. You invest more, try harder, become more patient, more understanding, believing that if you do everything right, the connection will stabilize. But what's actually happening is an old emotional loop being reactivated. You are not only responding to who they are, you are responding to what the dynamic represents. A chance to finally turn uncertainty into security. That's why it becomes so hard to walk away. Leaving doesn't just feel like losing a person, it can feel like giving up on resolving something unfinished inside you. But the truth is simple. No relationship can heal a pattern it keeps repeating. If the structure is built on inconsistency, effort alone cannot turn it into stability. You cannot solve unpredictability by investing more into it. This is where clarity becomes necessary. Once you see that the intensity is more about activation than alignment, something shifts. You stop asking, "How do I fix this?" and start asking, "What is this activating in me?" That moves you from reaction to awareness, from chasing to observing. And it leads to a deeper question. Are you connecting from inner stability or from unresolved need? When you're grounded, you're drawn to consistency, openness, and emotional reciprocity that grows over time. When you're not, you're more likely to be drawn to what feels familiar, even if it's unstable. That isn't a flaw, it's a pattern. And patterns can be understood, and once understood, changed. The goal isn't to overanalyze people or label them. It's to understand yourself so clearly that someone else's inconsistency no longer overrides your clarity. Because when you stop trying to resolve the past through the present, you stop confusing emotional activation with real connection. You begin choosing based on alignment, not intensity. Zooming out, the pattern becomes clear. Distance creates desire, inconsistency heightens attention, push-pull cycles intensify emotion, and mirroring creates illusion. But what feels powerful is not always what is healthy. What feels intense is not always stable. And what feels rare is not always real. Avoidant patterns aren't dangerous by intent. The distortion happens in perception. They can make inconsistency feel meaningful, distance feel attractive, and emotional unavailability feel like something to earn. And without awareness, you don't just attach to the person, you attach to your interpretation of them. You start valuing uncertainty over clarity and emotional highs over stability. But once you see it clearly, the pull changes. You stop mistaking confusion for depth. You stop chasing what comes and goes. You stop investing in what cannot consistently meet you. Because real connection doesn't require decoding. It doesn't rely on absence to create meaning. It doesn't trade your peace for excitement. It shows itself through presence, consistency, and emotional availability that remains steady when things become real. That becomes the standard. So the next time you feel that pull, the intensity, the intrigue, pause and ask, what is this actually built on? That question shifts everything. It brings you out of interpretation and back into reality. And reality is where clarity begins. At the end, this isn't about avoiding people. It's about no longer abandoning your own clarity while trying to understand them. Because the most meaningful connections will never be built on emotional turbulence. They will be built on emotional truth. Because in the end, what you're truly choosing isn't just a person. It's whether you want to keep living in emotional intensity that confuses you, or step into clarity that finally brings you peace.